Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tara Gujadar. I'm the co-founder and co-director of the Traditional Arts and Ethnology Center, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to our third webinar in this series entitled Dressing to Remember, Hmong Textile Traditions and Change. This is being given by Pachia Lucy Vang, an old colleague and very good friend of TAEC. I'm really happy to see so many participants attending this morning, so thank you all for spending time this morning or evening, wherever you might be in the world. A particular thank you to those of you who were able to make a contribution, a donation. We really appreciate that. It helps to keep these talks going and to contribute to TAEC's ongoing activities. For those of you who might not be familiar with TAEC, let me just give a brief introduction. TAEC is a cultural heritage social enterprise based here in Luang Prabang in northern Laos. We run a museum, handicraft shops, we do artisan training. We also advocate for better recognition of intellectual property rights of traditional designs. We do education and outreach activities as well as research. And a lot of our work is also trying to help disseminate information, anthropological research to make it more accessible for a wider audience. So things like these talks here. Of course, we have a website, we have all the social media, Facebook, Instagram, etc. So please do give us a follow if you want to hear about future talks that we have scheduled, as well as the other activities we have. For this morning, just so that you're aware, this talk is being recorded. It will be shared by link on email after we're finished here, and it will eventually make its way to YouTube. Any questions you have through the session, please do leave them in the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as possible after Pachia is done with her presentation. Now, shifting to introducing Pachia. So Pachia Lucy Vang is a Hmong textile researcher and maker with a very diverse background in community organizing, in design and curation. She has a BA in Anthropology from UC Berkeley, but is currently an MFA Design student at UC Davis, where she's focusing her practice on expanding textiles and exhibitions to create a community-centered space for Hmong arts. We've known Pachia for, I think, around 7 years, Pachia, or so, when she first approached TAEC about interning with us, and she provided a lot of virtual support to us with translation and some advice and assistance before she was actually able to travel here to Luang Prabang. And she worked with us from September 2017 to February 2018. And during that time, she accomplished a huge amount, including curating an exhibition on Hmong textiles called One Cloth, Many Threads, the Diversity of Hmong Textiles. She also assisted with research on traditional music and wind instruments. She provided a lot of translation and interpretation work with Hmong communities and Hmong community informants. And she also did visual communications for us. She helped to coordinate and organize a great talk we had with a visiting Hmong American shaman who uses textiles in his work. So she did a huge amount with TAEC, and you can see her kind of dabbled throughout our YouTube page and other places in our work. Before she came to TAEC, one of the things we found particularly compelling with Pachia is that she was part of the Hmong Story 40 project, which was a project commemorating the 40th anniversary of the Hmong refugees arriving in the United States. And for that, among other things, she had curated a display on story cloths. After she left TAEC in 2018, she went on to do a number of things. not least of which was be crowned Miss Hmong USA 2019, which was incredible. And there are wonderful photos of her wearing fantastic outfits on the internet, if you look for them. Now, in addition to being the design student, she also owns and operates Culture Through Cloth, which is an online business dedicated to bandao, which are the Hmong flower cloths. So her work is really informed by her life experience as a Hmong person and a Hmong American person, I would probably say. And also what's great about Pachia is that she's also traveled a great deal in Southeast Asia and China, exploring and connecting with Hmong communities around the world. So we're really excited and really honored to have her speaking here. So I will hand it over to Pachia. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tara. That was a really wonderful introduction. Let me just go ahead and get my screen set up here. Okay. Okay, well, I'm just overjoyed and overwhelmed by how many people are here right now. And so I think you all can hear me, correct? Let me just double check. Yes, okay.
Yep, all looks good.
Okay, good. So thank you again. I'm really excited to be here. It's been a long time since I've connected with TAEC. As Tara said, I've known TAEC and I've worked with TAEC almost 7 years ago. And so it's been quite a while and I've done quite a lot of different things, but my love and passion has always been with Hmong textiles. And, you know, there's so much to learn about textiles, so much more to learn about the Hmong identity and Hmong history. And so I hope that today's talk can give you just a very short glimpse into, you know, the depth of all of that. So I'm going to be talking about dressing to remember today. When we talk about memory among the Hmong people, I think it's really important to talk about our diaspora. So the Hmong are an ethnic group, and I feel like many of you here probably know who they are, which is why you're here and you're interested in this talk. So I don't want to go too much into all the nitty-gritty details, but our diaspora really defines our experience as an ethnic group. It also really is something that defines the way we look at the world. And when we talk about clothing, it plays a huge part in our clothing and our textile traditions as well, right? And so this is a story cloth that is quite a popular story cloth that outlines the Hmong diaspora. We trace our ancestral homelands to China, specifically central China, and then more recently southwest China. But here you can see that throughout all of the places we've been, we've really held on to that and remembered that. So we're all throughout Southeast Asia. We live in the southern parts of China. We live in Vietnam. We live in Laos. We also live in Thailand and parts of Burma. And then after the Secret War, we dispersed all throughout the globe. So you can find pockets of Hmong people in America, in Canada, Australia, down into even Argentina and South America. So we're really all over the place now. But one thing that, you know, we've really carried with us as a part of remembering who we are our textile traditions. And so that's something that I want to make a point of here. This is another story cloth that I just wanted to share with everyone. Like Tara was saying, I curated an exhibition on story cloths with Hmong Story 40. And I really like these early story cloths. So this was a story cloth from the early 1980s, a part of the collection from Shell Miller that we put on display. And I really just, when I first saw these story cloths, I thought they were amazing, because for those of you who are familiar with story cloths, they look very similar to the last one that I showed. They're very formulaic. They're like printed a very certain way. All of the people look a certain way now. But when you dig back into those really old story cloths, you see all sorts of artwork and artistry. But I really like this story cloth because I think it expresses a lot of who the Hmong have historically been. So we've been an agrarian people, we've lived in the mountains and in nature. We have a very strong ethnic identity. We also, have animistic cultural practices related to our practice in shamanism. And these are the things that really define the way that we look at the world, our outlook on the world, and our perspective. Here's another story cloth example that I really liked, and I just like how this piece kind of documents like daily life and all of the different things you would have seen, the dangers you would have seen as well too. So it's kind of cute seeing, the man there in the center. Maybe if I can move my mouse, there's a man here. And then the tiger is attacking him, and kind of looking at this, it looks very like cute and heartwarming, but it also really displays the dangers that people faced living in nature and the hardships that they faced. And so I just think these types of story cloths show like such a great array of history. And I wanted to start with the story cloths because I feel like they're very direct depictions of how our textiles have held on to our stories in ways that you can visually see. Whereas we move on to clothing, it's a little bit more hidden. You can't really see all of the stories embedded in our clothing. And to this day, there are many of us who still continue to practice making story cloth. So if you're in Luang Prabang, when you go to the night market, story cloths are still being produced. And here in the US, they're not being produced as much, but there's sort of these resurgence to reconnect with textiles that's been coming about. And I follow this wonderful artist. Her name is Cha Her, and she made this wonderful collection of story cloths really outlining the things that have been important to her in her life, which I thought was just fascinating because for a really long time, their story cloths weren't being produced. When they first started being produced in the refugee camps, they were really forms of expression, just sort of like the examples I showed you. They showed a vast array of pictures and imagery. And then as time went on, they became commodified and really became sort of these formulaic pieces that were being sold, where you would see the same imagery, you would see the same stories. And then they kind of just stopped. And I don't remember seeing much change in them, right? But I think with this new resurgence and interest in how our textiles tell stories, we're starting to see story cloths come back. And this is a great example. And from this example as well, I've seen multiple like school projects for high schoolers, where high schoolers have created their own story cloths. And I just really think that that's great. So a little bit more about this piece. The one here on Laos is showing Cha's parents' journey back to Laos. And I just love how it showcases like bits of who we are today, right? That would kind of break the stereotypes of people and what they envision Hmong people to be. So you see some text messages here, and then on the right, there are just things that are important to her in her life. Some of the art projects that she's done, her jewelry, her earpods, which I think is just really great and just shows a range of lifestyles. So there's many Hmong people still living in Southeast Asia today in villages and in mountain regions, but there's also many of us that are living in modern society in America. Not to say that villages aren't modern, but there's always that contrast that people like to talk about. However, this talk is really going to focus on clothing because our textile traditions, like many people's textile traditions throughout the world, have always been associated with dress first and foremost. And so you can see here, I love this image because it just shows a variety of dress in Laos among the Hmong, but also among other ethnic groups like the Tai Le, and of course the Lao people themselves. Dress has always been a way to define our ethnic identities. So our textile traditions are called bandao. So the act of making textiles, we call bandao or making bandao. Ba means flower and dao means cloth. And I always like to start out my talks with this definition because I think it's very poignant, right? Well, ba means flower and shows this connection to the land and the earth and nature. Dao, on the other hand, is the word for cloth. But at the same time, Dao has been used within our language in various ways to refer to the term Daun Dao, which means paper or document. And on a spiritual level, it also refers to destiny, one's life destiny. And I feel like that's just such a great connection because when we start diving into our textiles and the history or the traditions behind our textiles, there's sort of this story that gets revealed about our like the Hmong journey, which has almost felt like a type of destiny that we've been following with the active diaspora and dispersing throughout the world. So talking about Dao and Daunda and documents and paper, it's believed that originally our textile designs were actually our ancient writing system when we had a civilization long ago in central China. However, when that civilization fell and then we had to really disperse throughout the region, throughout Asia, we weren't able to carry on with that writing system. And so instead of just simply not having it, we decided to embed the symbols into our clothing to carry with us. And so a lot of the patterns that have endured throughout time, that have really connected us and created an identity for us is rooted in this idea of textiles being connected to text, to writing, which is not just something unique to the Hmong, but many other ethnic groups also have this. There's also that connection between textiles and text, like I just noted as well. And so this is a reoccurring theme throughout time and throughout the world that Hmong are also practicing and a part of and have really expanded to be a part of our traditions. So let's just go ahead and look more at what bandao or flower cloth is. So to make flower cloth and to make bandao, you really have to first make cloth. And traditionally, we associate Hmong cloth with hemp. But when you start looking at a lot of the old textiles or the old clothing that we use, you can see that we used a variety of cloth from cotton to linen to even silk. However, hemp has a very spiritual role in the Hmong culture and in Hmong spirituality. And we've had a long history of growing hemp, which is also quite interesting because some of the earliest forms of paper in China evidence showed that they came from the fibers of hemp fabric. And so some of the first paper that you find in China were actually made out of these leftover fibers from the process of making hemp. Bandao or flower cloth also includes a lot of batik. And so a batik is, batik is a practice among the Hmong. It includes drying using beeswax and then dyeing the fabric in an indigo vat to turn into a very dark blue color. And we've traditionally done this on hemp, especially the Hmong in Laos, but I've seen it done on cotton as well. And so this is a practice and a textile tradition that's carried all throughout China and Southeast Asia that the Hmong still carry today in Laos. However, it's not really done as much anymore outside of Asia. So it's not one that is really kept up with. I only know of a few individuals who, in fact, I think I only know of one individual who's actually continuing to create batik here in the States. But here are just some more images of how that process goes. So you would dye or you would draw out the patterns with a drawing tool with beeswax, and then you would dye it in indigo a few times. And essentially, when the beeswax dries, then it protects that part of the fabric. And then when you dye it, the dye doesn't penetrate that part. So it stays white, whereas the parts of the fabric that haven't been covered by beeswax turn blue, and you just get these beautiful patterns, which really create a canvas then for more textile designs to go on top of. So one of those textile techniques that would then go on top of batik is applique, which is the act of, cutting out strips of fabric or shapes and then applying them down, as you see here. And this is a really great example from my late grandmother. I always grew up seeing her embroider and make bandao, but I didn't really get a chance as an adult and as a researcher to really speak with her about any of these things because she had already passed on. But when I had discovered this back collar piece that she made, I just thought it was really beautiful. So this is called dachonjai, this type of embroidery, or not embroidery, but textile, because of the triangles. Jai means triangles. So if you can see here, there's these tiny applique triangles that are just absolutely beautiful and extremely intricate and hard to make. And these are square bits of fabric that then go on the back of a woman's jacket. There's also reverse applique, so very similar to applique, but done in reverse. So instead of cutting out strips to create shapes, what you would do is you would cut the shape right onto the fabric and then fold the fabric down and lay it on another piece of fabric. And in doing that, the color underneath shows through so that you can see the form of the shape. And this is really popular on belts, which we'll go over a little bit later. And then last but not least, we have embroidery, which I think is the most commonly known form of bandao or Hmong textiles. And there's a variety of embroidery techniques that are used. The most common is cross stitching. This is done on Aida cloth today. And I really like cross stitching. It seems simple, but it's actually really difficult because it's a counted stitch. And so one missed stitch messes up your whole design and your whole pattern. So you do have to be very careful and, be very nimble with your needle. And then we also have chain stitching, which is quite popular. So this refers to the stitches that look like chains to create patterns. Generally, the patterns are drawn out ahead of time and then followed through on top with thread. And last but not least, we have a type of satin stitching. Among the Hmong in Vietnam, and I'm not sure if this is exactly the same for the Hmong in Laos, but they call this lo hai, bandao lo hai, which they actually refer to as being borrowed from the Mien people. And I think that this type of stitching is really interesting. I think it mimics actually weaving a lot, which is really interesting to me. So there's different types of embroidery as well, but I just wanted to go over the basics of how to make bandao or what bandao is made out of, because they're used in different ways then to create clothing that then define people, their lineage, along with their region. And in Laos, there has been, really 7 regions that the Hmong have been very pronounced in. And this is an image of a map that I created for the exhibit that I curated with TAEC when I was there back quite a few years ago, just outlining the 7 different regions and showcasing and highlighting the diversity of the Hmong people, because our clothing styles and patterns have meaning. They're linked to region, they're linked to lineage and group identification. So group identification is really interesting, and I just wanted to go over that a little bit more because I feel like it's something that many Hmong scholars are still working out and trying to better understand all of the time, especially with such a huge diaspora. So there's different ways that we can categorize the Hmong people. And here in italicized are the ways that we categorize ourselves. And then I've also listed some that aren't italicized that really have been placed on us by people who also want to understand who we are and to categorize us. So, we categorize ourselves by color, like black Hmong, white Hmong, green Hmong, red Hmong. And a lot of these categories actually refer to language. However, even within language, it's not necessarily always associated with color that describes your language. So, for example, there's the Hmong Lang, who are also in Laos, but quite often that's a language dialect, but they also get grouped into the Green Hmong. And so there's sort of this confusion because really in Laos, they've become one group. Although outside of Laos, in Vietnam and in China, they still remain as distinctively different groups, and they even have different names that they take on. Other than that, we also have been categorize ourselves by our clothing styles. So a lot of the outfits in Laos that are worn are called the Hmong She Plong outfits, which refer to the Hmong who wear, blue apron styled clothing. They have blue on their aprons. Flower Hmong is a very popular category or categorization that you hear throughout Vietnam. However, when you speak to those flower Hmong, they don't call themselves flower Hmong. They're actually black Hmong, or they're Hmong Lang. And then there are the striped Hmong, which in Hmong is called Hmong Quam Ba. And so these are the Hmong that have stripes on their arms. However, they also designate, what type of language they speak, whether they're Hmong Lang or Hmong Du or Hmong Da, that can change as well. And one new category that I think I've discovered recently is, categories of migration. And so there's this concept actually in the Luang Prabang region of the new Hmong and the old Hmong. And so I've always heard this thrown around, but it never occurred to me that there were new Hmong and old Hmong, because my family were always called the old Hmong who wear the blue apron styles that were white Hmong. So I'm Hmong Da, Hmong Lao, na chế Hmong She Plong, right? However, there are also the Hmong Chia who came into the region in Luang Prabang. So I'll just go over that. So here you see two images of relatives on the left, and then my maternal grandmother on the right. And my dad's side are the old Hmong, which I just described, who wear these traditional Luang Prabang styles of the blue apron and the blue cuffs and the flower pom-pom hats. However, I always assumed that my mom's family came from the northern parts of Laos, which they technically did, but they do associate themselves actually with the Luang Prabang region, and they're known as the New Hmong because they came here more recently. And so groups that migrated earlier are called the Old Hmong, and groups that migrated later down on the road, maybe perhaps one generation ago, are called the New Hmong. And you can see the differences in style and clothing that I just want to go into. So focusing in on my grandmother, right here on the left are the striped Hmong outfits that I think many of us would consider as traditional now. But it's very interesting because my mother's side of the family, my grandmother, my grandfather, they still remember migrating from Vietnam. And so they're only one generation removed from coming from Vietnam. And maybe about 20 years ago, they were able to travel back to Vietnam and track down their relatives. And so when they went to Dien Bien Phu, they got to visit long lost relatives, and they took this photo, which I thought was very interesting, of the striped Hmong in Dien Bien Phu province. So you can see there are some similarities, but because they've moved down into the Luang Prabang region, there's also been a lot of assimilation. So they've taken on this sort of blue aprons. They've kept the stripes, but the stripes have gotten quite large because generally the Hmong in that region have very large blue cuffs. And then if you go back, further into Vietnam in Son La province, which is the province over, you can continue to see this variation of striped Hmong dress there. But you can kind of see this sort of evolution with migration, which I think is really interesting, because then it begs to brings up the question of like, what is tradition, and do traditions stay the same or do they change? But really, traditions are always changing, and they've always been in change. And I think when we start thinking more about this, then even today, our traditional clothing, you can see, have changed drastically, because just one generation ago, my grandmother and my mom were wearing what we would consider these traditional outfits that changed quite a bit with migration down into Laos. And now, with globalization, we are just wearing all sorts of traditional outfits. We blend things from all over the world. We create new outfits, new styles, but there are very specific things that also continue to stay the same. And so I want to go over what some of those things are, and just kind of think more about what are the defining characteristics of traditional Hmong dress. So let's just go through sort of an anatomy of Hmong dress. So let's start with the jacket. So one way that you can really define or really see things that still continue to define what a Hmong jacket are include, the collars, a jacket that has very defined collars, defined cuffs. And in Hmong women's jacket in Laos and throughout many parts of the world, they also have the da cha, which is the square piece that I had mentioned that goes right on the back of the neck. Some call it like the neck collar piece. And then also cropped jackets are a defining characteristic of Hmong jackets as well. So if we take a closer look, you can see here that in Laos, there are really two variations of this women's jacket among the white Hmong. So there are some white Hmong that like to wear a dark blue, whereas others that like to wear a light blue. The dark blue is more associated with like the Sengkuang, Vientiane region, whereas the light blue is associated with Luang Prabang, Luang Namta, and Udon Sai regions. But again, like the things that define it, aside from color, are the collars, the back piece, neck piece, along with the cuffs. And you can see this in the green Hmong or the Hmong Lang jacket as well. So the colors have changed, and they've actually added, applique technique onto the collars, and the cuffs have disappeared. But overall, the defining characteristics are still there that help you understand this is a Hmong jacket. These are some examples of men's jacket. So men's jacket, I've noticed, tend to incorporate more outside or mainstream influence. They have buttons and fasteners. They use a little bit more technology and tools, I guess you could say. But they continue to share some of those same components. So you can see the blue cuffs here. Men's jackets are oftentimes cropped as well. And so even with this very like elaborately embroidered cropped top though, a lot of the bandao is done in the same areas, like on the neck or on the collar and the closing section, along with the cuffs. And this is the man's jacket, so then it doesn't have that back collar piece. Men also wear vests. So this is an example of an older vest, and then one of a newer one that you can find today at like Hmong New Year's all throughout Laos and in America. And I just think it's interesting because these vests have stripes, and there's this older photo that I've had. I just collect photos of outfits and clothing that I see, but there's this older photo of these striped Hmong women wearing vests. And so I do kind of wonder if there's some connection there. And then moving on to skirts. So Hmong skirts have always been defined by their pleats. All throughout the diaspora, Hmong skirts are pleated. whether these are small pleats or very large pleats. A Hmong skirt is made out of three main areas that are attached together. So there's the top area here, and then that is the waistband, and then the middle section that is made using batik and some applique work, and then the bottom section, which consists of embroidery. And these are examples from TAEC's exhibition, permanent exhibition. So here's a classic white Hmong skirt associated with the white Hmong. And this is a black Hmong skirt from Vietnam. So you can see that it's darker. It's also more colorful, but mainly like dark, therefore associated with the black Hmong, and filled with batik and applique. Not so much heavy on the embroidery. And then this is a Hmong length skirt from Thailand. And these really bright colors are very popular in Thailand, along with these triangle applique and this type of embroidery. A really popular type of skirt right now that is all the rage are these new skirts, and many people, many artisans throughout Laos actually are making these beautifully crafted skirts right now. There's a huge market here in the US. People, like I've been saying, are really interested in Hmong clothing and, you know, wearing Hmong clothes and purchasing Hmong clothes. So the market is hot. And this skirt really blew up in 2020 and 2021. And one of the really popular artisans is known as Ntaub. And so this skirt has been coined the NN skirt. And she's not the only one. There's also like the MM skirt, I think. And I think there's like a few other ones like the SS skirt. I might be incorrect on that last one. But really these skirts are popular and they're different, although they follow the same patterns of like how skirts have always been made traditionally, but they're different. The innovation in them is that they use these cotton crystal polyester fabrics that are actually, I believe, made in Japan. But these were really popular back in the 80s and 90s, and they've had a resurgence. Generally, they were used in the past to simply make aprons or jackets, but now they're being used to as applique work on skirts. And in Hmong, the name for this is called Ntaub. And so you can see these are more NN or Ngantong skirts. Very, very beautiful and very, very popular right now. And just more examples. Okay. Another thing that has really remained and stayed the same are belts and aprons. So belts and aprons are continued to be worn. Here are two girls from the Sengkuang region and then my grandmother. And you can see that in Laos, red and green are prominent color choices for belts. So all throughout Laos, people will wear red and green on their belts and this, or on their waist, and this is to commemorate the crossing of the red and green rivers, because Southeast Asia is divided from China by the Red and Green River. And so it's to commemorate that diaspora and that cross into Southeast Asia, away from China, away from the original homelands into these new homelands that we have. And you can see here they're worn in different styles. So in the Sengkuang region, they were originally, the green was dangled in the front with a tail, and the pink or the red, because pink and red are interchangeable, was dangled in the back. For my grandmother, the striped Hmong, they often liked to wear their belts without any tails. So without anything hanging out, they would wrap themselves all up and they would intercross and weave their belts together. And so among the Hmong and Long Prabang, the white Hmong and Long Prabang, they would tie their belts in the back to create a tail, and they would wear it with the apron. So this is just an example of how it's tied. The belts above, or the belts in the previous slide, were just belts made out of fabric, like long sashes. But here are images of how belts are actually made out of embroidery work or applique and textiles, so bandao. So these are some traditional belts that would have been made. Generally, these belts consist of 5 squares. That's the formula for the belt. So they're made out of 5 squares. I've seen sometime they're made out of 4 squares, but they would divide that 4th square in half to continue to create that image of 5 squares put together. And oftentimes they were also attached to the apron so that they can be worn really easily, so that you don't have to tie the apron on and then tie the belt on. This was really popular like during my grandma's time. However, today, I don't really see this worn as much anymore in this style. Belts have really just become independent things. So they don't really have sashes attached to them to tie on anymore. You can just pin them with a safety pin. So this is the belt that I own. And you can see here, I just wear it over a sash. And the applique squares have really been turned into like long strips that are more, you can still see the square or the rectangular shape here. Many times they just don't have that separation anymore. But also the tail now no longer exists, but well, it exists, but it's not tied on to create a tail. The tail pretty much is just a separate panel that is sewn on the back. And you can see a better example of what that would look like when you wear it in the back of you. And then headdresses. Headdresses are also a very defining factor of our clothing and dress. And so you can see here cloth was like a huge symbol and form of wealth in the past. And so wrapping your heads in just yards and yards of cloth was something that was done. And these are striped Hmong from the past, and then more recent Hmong outfits. So in the past, headdresses were wrapped on, but more recently they've really become hats that can be simply placed on the head. Generally on an everyday daily life, you would wear you would have worn like a black plain one. But I've noticed that, when the Hmong are able to settle more and, experience more of a vibrancy in culture, then they start to add more ornamentation onto their simple head wraps, and they start to change the shape and form. And so this has resulted in just a variety of hats, which we can go into. So this is a great example of different hats. And this is a good example of hats that would be considered to our generation traditional because it's the way that our parents and grandparents worn them, but also includes a lot of like brand new hats that have just started being made or discovered and then morphed and formed into these new styles. So from the Udomsai and the Luang Prabang region, they wear the flower headdress or the flower head wrap, which is a long wrap that has these pom-poms and tassels on the ends. And in Udomsai, they twist it and it gets a little skinnier, whereas in Luang Prabang, it's the same size all throughout, and then it's just one size around. But they look very similar, and they're both called flower head wrap, puapa. This is something that would be considered more traditional because it came from our grandparents' generation. These are also considered more traditional. So from the Luang Namta and also moving into Sayaburi, Luang Prabang region, also variations of the flower head wrap or the puapa. The Luang Namta style here can also be seen into Thailand as well. And again, quote unquote, traditional head wraps. end hats. And then here are some newer variations, right? So inspired from the striped Hmong that live all throughout Laos, but are generally associated with Hua Pan province, also moving into Vietnam, like I have already talked about. But you can see that this one is quite traditional. I don't have like an exact photo to compare it to, but this would be the traditional head wrap that this group we are depicting here wears the black striped Hmong in Hua Pan province. However, there's coins that have been added on. And this hat here looks to me like a totally new invention of this traditionally like just very large wrapped head wrap that then has taken applique fabric from some of the Black Hmong flower groups in Vietnam and placed it on top with tassels. And then last but not least, these sort of pointy shapes are associated with the Vientiane, Sengguang area, which I think a lot of people might also associate with Giang Hong Mo Peng, because they're also from that area and that region. But I really think that these styles of hats, and there's not an actual picture of it here, but this shape influenced these new hats, so these princess hats that became really popular in the 80s and 90s, and have had a resurgence recently in 2020. So you can see now they're called the princess hat. In the past, they kind of looked like the rooster hat, like a newer variation of the rooster hat. Here you can see the same shape, but they've added pom-poms on the top, kind of mimicking what they do in Sayaburi and in Luang Nampa area, along with Luang Prabang area. So just very interesting, because now these hats are a part of our, dress vocabulary. Like these are hats that would be worn to the Hmong New Year, but would not necessarily have any specific association with regions per se, because they're newer inventions, or with specific groups, because they're kind of just newer inventions that don't have that. And of course, last but not least, we have the purple turban, known as the Po Zong Shua, from the Sengguang region, which is a tried and true, very iconic hat that is worn to this day. And so other things that remain the same are symbols, symbols that have endured throughout time. And if you haven't seen HmongEmbroidery.org before, I think it's a really great resource. I go there all of the time just to remind myself and to relearn things, because I'm always relearning things as well. But this is a snapshot of symbols, a list of symbols. They have a really great list of symbols that are used in Hmong embroidery. A very prominent symbol that we see all throughout Hmong textiles and all throughout the world, really, and many ethnic textiles and indigenous textiles, is this symbol of the swirl. And among the Hmong people, it's called the snail in Laos. It takes on various names in different parts, like in Vietnam. They also call it the snail, but when it becomes like, this is a double snail, for example, and this becomes the elephant's foot. However, in Vietnam, this is not known as an elephant's foot. It would be known as like 4 individuals around a hearth. And in some parts of China, the swirls are inverted, so they're going out, and that actually represents the head of a golden pheasant, which is a totem animal to some Hmong groups that they worship and find sacred. And then, more popularly among many Hmong Americans and Hmong in the West, along with Hmong in Laos, is this heart symbol that the snail has been turned into, which also looks like the ram's horn here. There are a variety of enduring symbols, such as the house symbol. So this full image here is the house symbol, and when you just take off one side of it, it becomes like a ladder or like stairs. The X symbol is very prominent, also called the cross. And when you combine it, it becomes a hook, which I see quite often in a lot of batik and applique, and then diamonds are very popular. This symbol right here is a flower symbol. This one is a cucumber seed, but you can see it looks very similar to a flower as well. And then again with the chicken's eye, I think chickens are very sacred within the Hmong culture. I was mentioning the golden pheasant. It's a type of bird, just like the chicken is a type of bird. Seeds and plots of land or garden, which all connect back to this idea of nature and land and region and place. So an example, this, I showed you this image earlier, and this was made by my grandma probably in the 80s sometime. But more recently, I received an outfit from an elderly woman that I got to know, who's also a wonderful, wonderful banbao artist and maker. And she had cross-stitched, not appliqued, the back jacket for me. And when I really started taking a closer look at it, I realized, although it's not identical, the form is still the same, which I thought is just amazing, because two different makers made in two different times, and yet they still remember these patterns in their minds to recreate. I don't know if they had something to look at, or if it's just something that is ingrained in them and that they remember and that is shared among a people, which I think is so powerful. And so some of the motifs that you can see that I was kind of mentioning is this flower motif here taking place. So here it's appliqued on, and then here it's just cross-stitched on. And then again, not necessarily the house symbol, but like the ladders or the sides of the house here on the edges, which are repeated. This particular symbol is actually which translate as like the monster's finger, which I think is very interesting. If you watch one of my previous videos I did with TAEC, I actually talked about how these back neck pieces, they're meant to protect us, because they're generally divided in half like this, creating this image of like two eyes or like two sides of the face that can fool like evil spirits into thinking that the front and the back are the same, and that you always have eyes in your back also, so they can't try anything tricky. I still love that. But people have many different reasonings and stories behind why things are the way they are, so that's one of them. And again, you see these really beautifully made tiny applique triangles, which take form here as stitches, not exactly cross stitches, but also stitches here. And just kind of going off of this idea of enduring symbols, I think that when you look at our textiles throughout time, these are square funeral pieces that are also technically the back neck collars, but they're separated and used separately. And this would be something that is carried with a person into the afterlife, and would be considered a part of funeral attire, something you would put in the coffin with the individual. But I just think it's so interesting, because these were made at completely different times. So the first one was made in 1940, the second one was made in 1984, and the last one was made in 2009 by completely different people. But the symbols have remained exactly the same. The patterns have remained exactly the same. And it's just so amazing to see how all throughout time, even with this changes in styles and fashions, these are symbols that have stayed the same and continue to connect us. Symbols that we can then find with Hmong Miao groups throughout Southeast Asia and up into China, even when we don't speak the same language or identify in the same way. Our clothing patterns our clothing styles have changed. The symbols and the patterns that we use have remained the same. And so just some concluding thoughts. Textiles have always been a form of storytelling and documentation that have really helped us remember who we are, like I was just saying. And yet they've always been in change because fashion is always changing. the one thing about, you know, in fashion studies and fashion theory, the one thing about fashion all throughout the world is that it constantly changes. But within traditional Hmong clothing, there are really forms and shapes and patterns that don't change and really remain the same, that are really symbolic for helping us maintain group identity based on our lineage, you know, the language that we speak, the dialects, our migrational patterns, the regions that we've settled in, that really help us to, you know, remember who we are, because we haven't historically had a way of documenting that in writing per se. So it helps us remember the places we've lived, the places we've called home, the lands that we've been on, and really our history and this sense of diaspora that connects us all together. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Pachia. That was fascinating, super interesting. We're right at 10 o'clock at the moment, and which I know we're supposed to be just an hour, but I think we could take a few more minutes to answer a few questions. So we have a few questions that are sort of shorter, just sort of a bit more factual. So maybe I'll just start with those quickly, and then we can get more into, if we have more time, some more of the complex questions. So one of them was, so a couple starting questions is, do you know why women's tops have the dacho but not the men's? And why are some of the Hmong men's jackets cropped? Is it stylistic or a regional thing?
Oh, those are great questions. I don't know if I can answer all of that because I'm sure it differs in different regions, but there's I mean, it's quite interesting that there's a marker for being a woman, and that kind of plays into these, you know, greater issues with patriarchy. But there is a folk tale that talks about how women were really marked for being bad, and they have to like wear this dacha sort of like to indicate that. And it's quite long, so I don't want to go like fully into it. I think I might have covered it in one of the videos we did. But that's one story I've heard. I don't know if there are any others. I think there might be others out there, like in China, that kind of describe why. But there are also practical reasons at the same time. Like, for example, for funeral processes, when you are doing the ceremony and then you have the individual, those collars actually help you to carry the individual when it's time for burial.
Right, I've heard that as well about the funerals and the funeral clothing. And then the men's shirts being cropped, is it some are cropped and some aren't? Is that a regional or a trends thing?
I don't know if I can answer that. I mean, I think I have to kind of expand my knowledge on men's fashion, to be honest, because I'm a woman, so I've focused a lot on women's fashion. But yeah, I don't know if I can answer that.
Yeah, I guess I would say for me, just what the limited amount that I've seen, I think of the longer ones as being more modern. That, you know, in the past they were cropped, and now that's seen as maybe being a little risque or not
even
cool
feminine,
now.
maybe,
or feminine, exactly.
There's lots of things that have changed with men's fashion, like they don't wear headdresses anymore.
Right.
In the past, it would have made sense because you're working in the field, it's super hot in Laos. You would want to wear a cropped jacket, and now I don't think. I mean, I've seen people still wear it, but I don't think it's as popular.
The same, yes. I think during Hmong New Year, I've seen a little bit, but they're cropped. They're not cropped as short as the pictures,
or they'll wear
archival
like t-shirts under it too.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I've seen archival photos. I've primarily seen a lot of shorter cropped ones, but it may also be a regional thing. I also don't know. That's just sort of anecdotal. Somebody also asked about why the new Hmong, the Hmong Cha, migrated to Luang Prabang. Do you know why that particular
I don't know
exactly
happened? So that's something that I would need to research more.
Right.
However, there were always waves of migration And there always have been waves of migration. Like even coming to the US, there were waves of migration, people coming in the 70s versus people coming, you know, in the 90s, and the differences between that. And even those who come in the 90s are given like a separate name, like, oh, Hmong Pachia, which is kind of the same idea, like the new Hmong. And so, yeah, I don't know exactly why, but I do know, so my family, I didn't really get into it, but my mother's family, they were Black Hmong, and they, I don't know when exactly their outfits changed, right? So they were Black Hmong, but when they moved down to the Luang Prabang, Sayaburi area, they switched and they became White Hmong. They changed their language, and then their clothing changed. And I don't really know how that happened. My grandma is still around, so I can talk to her about it, but she doesn't really know either. Yeah.
Right. And another sort of quicker question, in terms of symbols such as the snail, which you showed towards the end of the talk, is that a modern interpretation, or did the elders identify it as such? Do you know about
in
that?
regards to like it being a snail, or?
I guess so. This was that's all that was in the question.
Yeah, I recently bought a new book on Miao textiles and Miao symbols, which I thought was really interesting because they refer to the swirl as really this symbol for life. And I think that makes a lot of sense because you see it all throughout the world in so many ethnic clothing.
Sure.
And so I don't really know the significance of the snail because that's the way it's interpreted in Laos and in Thailand, and now with Hmong in America. So I don't know that significance, but I do see like greater significance around the symbols like in China and among the Miao, where they're actually linked to like the butterfly and the butterfly's horns. And because many Miao groups believe that life came from a butterfly. And so that makes a little more sense to me.
Right.
But yeah.
Right. I also am seeing in the chat a couple of Hmong participants have said, I've heard that men's short crop shirts was due to a lack of fabric. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Some of it was made to make the pants. So that's something for us to learn as well, with a lot of different stories. Then a question sort of now shifting to some more of the trends and changes. There's, with the ever-changing aspects of our Hmong clothing, how do you see the younger Hmong generation preserving Hmong textiles and dress today? Is modernizing, excuse me, and modern means of Hmong dress considered cultural preservation?
Is it considered cultural preservation?
That's the last part of the question.
I think so, to some degree. I mean, I think this kind of makes me think about the concept of funeral attire because I've noticed that, you know, styles and trends come and go, and the styles of our grandparents and their grandparents today are considered like funeral attire because that's essentially what you would wear on your funeral bed, because when you go to meet your ancestors, that's what you have to wear so they recognize you. And so, you know, then it makes me wonder, well, what did they wear then? They must have worn their ancestors' clothing. So it goes back to the idea of it always changing. And I'm not sure if I'm hitting the question right on the dot. But I think, you know, I guess it is a form of cultural preservation. I think, however, we do, as young Hmong people spread out throughout the world, we have a longing to really like hold on to these traditional aspects of like knowing that this specific style came from this specific region, and this is where I was from, and this is where I came from. I think that is really important. But I don't really know where that's going to go now that that's not as important with today's generation.
Right, and I see a question then also about thoughts on what are your thoughts on globalization and commercialization and how that's affected and changed Hmong clothing. And that's something that I think you and I have also discussed before, because there's talk about appropriation, and when we've seen fashion shows or beauty pageants and they're incorporating a lot of different elements. What are your thoughts on that in particular?
Yeah, I think I'm still like formulating a lot of my thoughts on that, right? Because I think I see like this great joy in people to be creating and wearing all of these new types of styles and designs, but at the same time there are like very like critical concerns about consumption, about you know, like exploitation, like exploitative work practices as well. And so I do feel like, you know, textiles have different form and function. There's a very like sacred and spiritual form to textiles. And then there's now this new emerging like fashion trend aspect to textiles. And there are these different spaces that that have been created for it. And so maybe that's a place for us to start, because then, you know, this whole fashion that's producing clothing at such a large rate, I think also plays into like fast fashion and the issues of, you know, sustainability. There's just so much there. I don't really exactly know how to answer.
Sure, and I do think that your suggestion that there's also different types of forms of clothing and reasons for producing clothing, and recognizing that there might be sort of a dichotomy. There's clothing that's really sacred, that there's a link to identity, to place, to home, and there's others that's just fun and creative and a fad and something you want to try out to feel good. So I guess it's when those two get kind of close together that people start getting a little nervous potentially.
I think you've hit it on the head.
So linked to that also, I'm seeing a few questions about the trends of Hmong in China and influences of modern Hmong clothing that potentially comes from China, that is sent to Hmong in Southeast Asia or in the United States, and whether Hmong diaspora in the United States may also be influencing Hmong in Laos and Luang Prabang, or vice versa. So how do you maybe see, or have you seen influences coming from different Hmong diaspora communities that may be stronger from in one direction or another?
Yeah, I think we all influence each other quite and I'm being aspirational when I say this, but quite equally almost in some ways, because I've seen when I was in Luang Prabang, like a lot of people were wearing like Chinese styled outfits from Yunnan province. That was really popular. That kind of became popular in the States here as well. But, you know, it's interesting that a lot of the Hmong in Southeast Asia and China actually consume Hmong American media quite a lot, I noticed. And so that plays a role in like the stuff that they're producing and making. And I mean, they're essentially the makers who are creating outfits for us to wear. So I feel like a lot of the new styles that come out of Laos are the ones being worn in the West. But then there are also instances of people here in America who then ask artisans and makers to like make very specific things that then kind of become trends as well. So there's this constant back and forth between the areas that I see.
Linked to that, is there, do you see much production happening in the United States? Are there many makers?
I think there are people making for themselves individually, but not on a mass level. And if there are many sellers who are importing mass-produced stuff in China here, because mass-produced stuff in China gets sent to Laos, and then they essentially use those mass-produced embroidery work to then create like outfits that are sent out. So there's sort of this chain.
Right. Okay. Maybe to wrap up, since we are about 15 minutes over time now, and I want to be respectful of your time as well. One last question, I guess that was a link to what we were just discussing, is about ownership of designs, particularly when it comes to designs that are being used in fashion and or that have been potentially appropriated. So I'm not totally sure if this is personal designs. So if perhaps a Hmong designer, or someone, a creative perhaps, has created a design that's then appropriated, or if it's just about ownership of Hmong designs in general. That, I mean, we know there was the example of the attendee to the royal wedding that was wearing, vintage Hmong clothing from Chiang Mai, and then there's an outcry about that. So perhaps
there are definitely issues of ownership in design. There's many cases of Hmong designs being used in by many large manufacturing companies without anything being returned to Hmong communities. And there's that issue that example that you really just listed. In that particular case, I think a lot of, so in that particular case, it was Prince Harry's wedding. And one of his ex-girlfriends had worn a Hmong, a dress essentially made out of Hmong textiles from Thailand. However, the company or the brand that was selling it marketed it as Hill Tribe or tribal. And didn't give credit to Hmong. And I think a lot of Hmong folks were very verbal and voiced their dissatisfaction with that. And so they changed it and they called it Hmong. But for me, I felt like that's not really hitting it on the head. It's not really about representation. It's about how there's just an inequality there where artisans are spending all of this time creating these beautiful pieces that mean so much to us as a community, that's communally owned, and then it's being taken and exploited and sold for profit without really anything coming back to our communities that are still very much in need. And so there's that really big issue there of inequality and not just necessarily representation that I continuously see.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, with a lot of the issues of appropriation, a lot of it is the inequality, the economic inequality, but also power inequalities. The fact that there are certain groups that are able to take pieces and use them, and there aren't benefits or recognition going back to the original producer, perhaps, and the original community. Okay, thank you very much. But I think we'll wrap it up now. I'm sure people could ask a million more questions, but I have shared your social media links in the chat. And actually, to everybody who attended, you'll get an email with a link to the recording, as well as links to Pachia's pages. So you could follow up with Pachia directly. Pachia, I want to thank you so much for making the time and doing this excellent talk. I have a feeling we will be asking you to do this again, just giving you a little bit of forewarning, because this was great. And thank you everyone for joining, and enjoy your evening or day.
Thank you all so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.